This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet, Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it. Welcome to Food Psych, a podcast about intuitive eating, health at every size, body liberation, and taking down diet culture. I'm your host, Christy Harrison, and I'm an anti-diet registered dietitian, certified intuitive eating counselor, and author of the book, Anti-Diet. Join me here every week as I talk with fellow anti-diet advocates about their journeys toward peace with food and their bodies. And by the way, on this show, we bleep out diet culture stuff like weight and calorie numbers, but we don't censor swear words or other adult language, so listener discretion is advised.
Anti-diet revolution, we're for health at every size. Eat the foods you like. Food Psych.
Hey there, I hope you are doing well and hanging in there. Welcome to episode 235 of Food Psych. I am, of course, your host, Christy Harrison, and today I'm talking with fat activist and writer Juliet James about helpful and unhelpful behaviors during the COVID-19 pandemic, weight loss surgery and its many complications, the role of childhood trauma in her eating disorder, the fat phobia she's experienced as someone on the very upper end of the weight spectrum, and so much more. It's a great conversation, and I can't wait to share it with you in just a moment. But first, a couple of notes about this episode. The first one is mostly just for any upcoming podcast guests who are listening to this, which is that I fast-tracked this interview and a few others in the coming weeks that I did recently during the COVID-19 situation so that they would be relevant to what's going on right now. But I'll definitely still air all of the other interviews I recorded previously. I just wanted to share some conversations about the pandemic now while it's at the top of people's minds. And then I also want to give a content warning about this interview because we're talking about weight loss surgery here, and it's mostly about the complications. But Juliet does share some of the reasons why she did it in the first place at the beginning of the talk, or at the beginning of that section, rather, where we talk about weight loss surgery. So just make sure to listen through to the end to hear what she has to say to anyone who's considering the surgery, because her thinking on the surgery has really changed since she decided to have it, and she doesn't recommend that anyone else have it, and she explains why. And finally, just another content warning for the fact that Juliet really went through a lot in her relationship with food in the past, and she had some major family trauma and very disordered eating, and she's definitely still in process. And specifically, she's struggling with eating post-bariatric surgery. That's a common issue, and I think it's a super important perspective to hear, and hopefully folks in the audience who've had bariatric surgery and are having these complications will resonate with what she has to say. But I also wanted to just highlight that in case it feels potentially triggering to you to hear about those struggles from someone who's still in the midst of it and, make a decision for self-care whether or not to listen to that part of the episode. And with that, I will answer this week's listener question. Also a content warning for the question itself because it has some fat-phobic and food-phobic language in it, so just skip ahead about 20 seconds if you want to avoid hearing that. It's from a listener named Lori who writes, "Hi, I'm a healthcare worker in Calgary. Before COVID, I was eating intuitively and my choices were nutritious and healthy. I'm finding in this pandemic, I'm eating chips and sugar and craving more carbs. What can I do to get back on track? I'm going to be a giant slug when this is all over if I keep this nonsense up." So thanks, Lori, for that question. And before I answer, just my usual disclaimer that these answers and this podcast in general are for informational and educational purposes only and aren't a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice. So first of all, Lori, as a healthcare worker, I want to say thank you for the work you do. I don't know what your role is in this pandemic right now, but all of us healthcare workers, I think, have a role to play. And this is a time of great stress, especially if you're on the front lines, but no matter what, for all of us, it's a time of incredible stress, and it's totally understandable to be eating more comforting foods and gravitating towards foods that are pleasurable and comforting and just make you feel good because this is a tough time, right? And there's absolutely nothing wrong with that. There's nothing wrong with eating foods that are delicious, that give you quick energy, and that make you feel satisfied. But the larger issue I'm seeing here is that I'm really noticing a lot of diet culture thinking, aka diet mentality, in your question. You're characterizing foods as quote unquote nutritious and healthy versus quote unquote nonsense. You're using a fatphobic metaphor of a giant slug. And so, given all of this diet mentality, it sounds like you probably weren't fully practicing intuitive eating before, because the foundational principle, the first principle of intuitive eating, is rejecting the diet mentality. So it sounds like you didn't fully embrace that principle and some of the other principles of intuitive eating. And in fact, you were actually turning intuitive eating into a diet. And when you're dieting, in whatever form it may take, even if you're calling the diet intuitive eating, it makes you feel restricted and deprived. And it sets you up to gravitate towards the foods that you are restricting and even feel out of control with those foods. So not only is there the normal response to a crisis situation like this of wanting foods that are comforting and delicious, which we all have, right? But you're also experiencing the backlash to the diet mentality, the backlash to having certain foods be deemed bad, and if not officially, quote unquote, off limits, then certainly mentally restricted. So what I would advise is going back to the foundational principles of intuitive eating, specifically working on rejecting the diet mentality and making peace with food. So that means recognizing that no foods are good or bad, healthy or unhealthy. There's no moral value to foods, that all foods have a place in your menu. And there's nothing wrong with the way you're eating. And you don't need to, quote unquote, get back on track with anything. That's another clue that diet mentality is afoot when you're thinking of yourself as needing to get back on track and that you've lost it somehow. And it's important to really feel that you truly have unconditional permission to eat anything you want, including carbs, including chips, including all of the other delicious things that you're wanting right now, as well as the foods that you had deemed, quote unquote, nutritious before. And so to do that work on rejecting the diet mentality and making peace with food, I would highly recommend reading my book, Anti-Diet, if you haven't done that yet. And it sounds from your question like you probably haven't. I wrote it specifically as a way to help people reject the diet mentality and make peace with food. And once you've really absorbed the messages in my book, I would also recommend going on to the Intuitive Eating Workbook by past podcast guests Evelyn Tribole and Elise Resch, who wrote the original Intuitive Eating book. I think the Intuitive Eating Workbook is a great fit for now because it's been fully updated and it's also really geared towards putting intuitive eating into practice. And they have a 25th anniversary edition of the book coming out this summer, but this is a little earlier. So what I recommend now is reading my book, Anti-Diet, for the purposes of rejecting the diet mentality, really coming to understand how the diet mentality is showing up for you and pushing back against it, dismantling diet culture wherever it lives in your brain, and learning why you don't need to categorize foods as good or bad, healthy or unhealthy. So you can get my book at christyharrison.com/book. That's christyharrison.com/book. And thank you again for this question. I'm really, really glad you asked it because I think this pandemic is a great signal that what you were thinking of as intuitive eating was actually still a diet. And now this is an invitation and an opportunity to dig deeper and to really get rooted in intuitive eating fully and completely. If you want to submit your own question for a chance to have it answered on an upcoming episode, you can go to christyharrison.com/questions. That's christyharrison.com/questions. And then if you want to ask me any question you want, multiple questions a month for a lifetime, you can join my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. The course has a monthly Q&A podcast that is just for course participants, where you get to ask your own questions every month and have me answer them. And you can also listen to hundreds of answers I've given to other participants already so that you can work through all the nuances and sticking points of intuitive eating and really put it into practice in your own life. If you're ready to break free from diet culture and reclaim the life it stole from you, you can learn more and sign up for the course at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. And if you want a lower cost introductory option, kind of a way to dip your toe into intuitive eating before doing the full course, you can sign up for my Taste of Intuitive Eating mini course, which is available at christyharrison.com/mini course. That's christyharrison.com/mini course. This episode of Food Psych is brought to you by my book, Anti-Diet: Reclaim Your Time, Money, Well-Being, and Happiness Through Intuitive Eating, which is now available wherever books are sold. Now is a great time to read the book because you probably have a bit more time on your hands with all the social distancing that's going on right now, and also because diet culture is really ramping up during this pandemic, and the book is a great way to push back against that. It goes into depth about diet culture and the ways it harms us, with tons of scientific references and resources to help you make the anti-diet case to the people in your life. It also lays out the foundation of intuitive eating that I was just talking about in my answer to Lori's question, and it helps you start making peace with food and your body. Just go to christyharrison.com/book to get it. That's christyharrison.com/book. And by the way, if you've read the book already and you loved it, as I know a lot of people listening to this podcast have done, I would be so grateful and psyched if you left an Amazon review and marked the other 5-star reviews as helpful as well. Those reviews help more people discover the book, which helps grow the anti-diet movement and ultimately helps make the world a safer place for people of all shapes and sizes, including the very largest sizes. And now, without any further ado, let's go to my conversation with Juliet James. So tell me about your relationship with food growing up.
I grew up in a family that got really kind of fractured because my parents split up when I was about 6. And my mom took us to my grandparents' house, and she had a history of addiction issues, so we wound up in my grandparents' custody later on, and I really bounced around from family member to family member. So basically, I got exposed to the hangups of all of my family members in ways that I don't think most children experience. But I had issues because I didn't get fed necessarily on schedule. Most kids today probably don't either because just the world is crazy. There's so much going on. But in my case, it was just, my mom was very young when she had me. She was only 17, and she had issues. She had addiction issues. And so sometimes it would be lunch and she might be asleep, or she might be otherwise occupied, and just not realize it. And so I think that I had moments of feeling food scarcity even when I was really, really young. And the first time I remember taking food on my own, I was probably about 4. And I remember that I went into the fridge and I got a package of raw hot dogs, uncooked hot dogs, which are not tasty. And I took them out and I started eating them. And I just remember feeling this sense of like I was doing something wrong that I shouldn't be doing. So I hid them, the rest of them, in a cabinet in a pot. And I don't remember how my poor mother found them, but it couldn't have been pretty is my guess. So that's like my first memory of kind of having to fend for myself. And for years, I looked at that and saw it as a binge. And it wasn't until really just in the last couple of years that I became aware of the fact that that wasn't a binge. That was a little girl who was hungry, trying to feed herself. That was definitely not a binge. And then around the same time, I was visiting my grandparents' house. They had powdered donuts. I was 4. Powdered donuts are awesome. I'm 44 now, so 40 years later, I can still say that. I love powdered donuts. They're great. So I wanted the powdered donuts, and they said no, probably because it was before dinner. But also my mother's family was obsessed with my weight even then, so it may have been that too. But they left the room, and I ate powdered donuts, not realizing that powdered donuts kind of tell on you. So they came back in the room, and they asked me, and I knew I was going to get in trouble, so I said the dog took them, which of course the dog didn't take them. And they knew that, and they called me out on it. And this story was told around my family like it was this big joke, and it was told in a way that was definitely meant to shame me. So yeah, my relationship with food growing up was pretty fucked up from the get-go.
Oh, it sounds really painful. It sounds like you were just sort of left at the whims of other people's issues, not just issues with food, but issues with like self-care and taking care of you. You sort of had to fend for yourself so young. I'm curious where you got the idea that that was a binge on the hot dogs.
I would guess that it probably came about as a part of multiple factors. One was my aunt, my mother's sister. I refer to my relationship with her as the most complicated relationship in my life, which is saying something. And she was the biggest person who was a problem for me about my weight. She's the one who put me on my first diet when I was 8 years old. So I would say that she probably helped to sort of start that idea in my head. She probably planted the seed. And then I was in the hospital for my eating disorder when I was 15. And I think between the therapy I got there, which was not necessarily great, but it was, 1991, so things were quite different. So I think between that and the things that my aunt would say, I figured that I must be binging if I was eating that way. Like, I don't think it ever occurred to me that it was just, you're really hungry. This is a normal response. I think that for years, if I was eating out of hunger, anytime I ate more than I thought I was supposed to, or than somebody else said I was supposed to, I would just assume it was a binge. So while I absolutely had issues with binging, even at a fairly young age, I think that a lot of the times that I binged or thought I was binging, I was really just trying to make up for a calorie deficit.
I feel like with kids, especially who are not given enough to eat, that happens. And then it's sort of like your identity can crystallize around that. And you're like, I'm this person who binges, right? And it sort of dismisses your actual needs for food.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I think it took me a really long time and a lot of therapy and introspection, and also just being introduced to the concepts of, intuitive eating, of health at every size, of just trusting your body and your instinct. And I think I was taught at a really young age that I couldn't do that I wasn't trustworthy, that my body wasn't trustworthy. And that had a major impact on the rest of my life.
How did it unfold from there? How did you go from those early days of, eating to get enough food and sort of secretly eating to being diagnosed with an eating disorder?
I actually just wrote an essay about this because, as I was saying to you before, I realized recently that I have a lot of trauma related to the food scarcity that was both forced upon me by family members trying to make my body smaller, but also by the situation with my mom. And at times we were also really poor. So, we would have government cheese or, government peanut butter, as people will refer to it. And, that might be all we would have in the house. So, I might have to eat like tablespoons of peanut butter or whatever, however much it took for me to feel like I'd eaten enough. But when you're eating tablespoons of peanut butter on a spoon, it doesn't feel like you're eating a meal. And that helped kind of contribute to the feeling that I was doing something wrong again. Like I was eating more than I should, or I was eating in a way that I shouldn't. It wasn't a normal way to eat. It wasn't the way normal families would eat, where they would sit down together and eat. And that was not something my family ever did. Even when I was in a more stable environment where my grandparents were, we really didn't tend to sit together. I mean, a few of us might, but it was pretty chaotic. And other than holidays, there was no real like family time at meals. So I was 8 the first time I was put on a diet. I started stealing food in my house as soon as they started leaving me home alone. Whenever I was at friends' houses, I would, try to get food, basically. Like I would sort of say something and try to get like, a snack or whatever. And I always felt like sneaky and manipulative for doing it, but I was hungry, So it was like, it was kind of, if I got invited to friends' dinner, it was always so nice because I didn't have somebody policing my food. I was in a church at the time, and I was going to choir practice, and the sisters that ran the choir and the youth group, there were two, spinster sisters, and they never married or had children or anything, and they would get a lot of like chocolate from like Hershey's because they had a sister-in-law who worked for Hershey's. So they would get it and, they would give it to the kids. And it became like this huge thing for me that I would get to have like chocolate because there wasn't anyone there to tell me not to. Anytime I did that, like if I ate more than one piece, I would feel like I was binging. And of course, that isn't a binge, but I didn't really understand that. And then I was 15 when I was formally diagnosed. And I was at the time diagnosed as a non purging bulimic, which I didn't even know was a thing. Like because I was a minor, they had to have a court hearing. So the psychiatrist had to be there and present the case because I was there against my will and I was a minor. And the doctor was asked the diagnosis and he said bulimia. And I was just like, dude, I don't purge. I'm not bulimic. What are you talking about? And at that time, whenever anyone, well, really by anyone, I mean my aunt more than anyone, would say anything to me about how I would eat, it was always, you're a compulsive overeater, which is one of the worst things that I think anyone told me. Like hearing that was so much more stigmatizing than hearing the doctor say I was bulimic, even though I didn't think I was. Although for non-purging bulimia, I fit the criteria at the time. I would binge and then I would restrict. And, at that time I wasn't exercising to compensate, but that came later in life.
And non-purging bulimia was kind of the predecessor to binge eating disorder, right? Like it wasn't in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual yet. So
Yeah, exactly. It didn't exist yet. So it was kind of the deal. Now it's kind of like I look at it and I think it's really sort of a hodgepodge of the two. There was definitely the aspects that are associated with bulimia, with restricting or over exercising, but then there were also the times where it was just straight up binge eating. There wasn't any real compensating, but the compensating always came later because it would come the next time I started to diet, and that. So like the compensating was there eventually.
And the restriction was there originally too. It sounds like it was the original driver, even from such a young age, was hunger.
Yeah, definitely. And, and I didn't see that even when I was in the hospital. They asked me when my first binge was, and that was what I told them, the hot dog story. And, at the moment that felt like this big revelatory moment in my life. Like, oh my God, I had my first binge at 4. That's so advanced, which is twisted, but that's the kind of thing an eating disorder makes you think.
Yeah. And also like how sad that nobody pointed out to you that hunger and deprivation and food insecurity played a role there too.
Right. And that kind of bugs me in retrospect. And that's one of the many issues I have with the treatment that I got as a result of that hospitalization is that, first of all, I was the only fat patient in that ward, if you can imagine what that would be like. And I wasn't just like a little bit fat. I wasn't a small fat. I wasn't a, average sized American woman fat even. I was pounds fat in a ward full of mostly teenage girls who were anorexic and underweight. Very few of them were people that anyone looked at and said, why are they here? And of course, that whole line of thinking is messed up in and of itself. But that was much bigger of a problem even then. It's a big enough problem now, but then it was even worse, And I am sure that there were times in my life where I probably met the criteria for an anorexia diagnosis based on how I was eating and how quickly I was losing weight at the time. But of course, no one would ever have diagnosed me with that. Even today they wouldn't, but then certainly not.
Right. Now at least there's the quote unquote atypical anorexia diagnosis, which is so problematic. I hate that term because it's not atypical. It's actually the most typical in terms of how there's more people in larger bodies or even quote unquote normal BMI category bodies that have anorexia than the emaciated picture that we are fed of anorexia, that we're told anorexia supposedly looks like.
Right. Yeah. And it didn't help that this was all like right around the time of the heroin chic thing, which was really upsetting for me because my mother at that point had a heroin problem and that was her alcohol addiction. She had resolved that, but as is so often the case, it turned into a different type of addiction. And, I'm so incredibly proud of my mom. And I just want to say that because she'll probably listen to this and I just want her to know. And I'm going to tear up, so I have to stop. But she's been sober for over 25 years and she has done a lot with her life since she got sober. And I am really proud of her. We don't always see eye to eye. We certainly have had our issues over the years, but I'm proud to be her daughter. And I understand now that addiction is a mental health issue. It's not something to shame someone for. When I was growing up, of course, living through that and also the time period that I was growing up in, I didn't always appreciate that.
Yeah, I'm sure that probably everyone around you and the war on drugs at the time made it out to be this thing that was like, it's within her control and you have to fight it and all that stuff. But yeah, that sounds like a really traumatic childhood in so many ways.
It was definitely very traumatic. I don't know why. I'm one of those people, like, I've always been able to talk really openly about my life. And I think in a weird way, it's almost a self defense mechanism. I think that it was a way for me to kind of put barriers up between me and the other kids as early as when I was in third grade. Because, as I mentioned, my mom had lost custody of my brother and I. I was the older one. I was almost 5 years older than him. So I was 8 and he was 3 at the time. And we were taken away from my mom. We were taken by police car to my grandparents' house in the next town over. And it was definitely really traumatic. And when we were there, when we were in the police car, I just remember feeling this like sort of sense of surreality. It was just, this was not my life. Like, this doesn't happen to me, like, how could this be happening? So there was definitely a lot of trauma, and it just took me so long to figure that out and piece it together. And I would just tell everybody like the truth. Like, they would be like, "Why did you come back to school in this town?" Because I had lived there for the first half of second grade, moved in the middle, and was back in third grade. And it's a small town, so that kind of thing really stood out to people. And the kids were like, "Why are you back?" Which is very nice, by the way. you know. And I think my attitude was basically, look, I'm no happier to be back with you people than you are to have me back. So just leave me alone. I just told them. It never occurred to me not to tell them the truth. And what is another 8-year-old supposed to do with that information? So, of course, it made me weird and it made me the strange freak kid. And, I kind of embraced that in some ways, I think. But it definitely was traumatic. And it took me so long to be able to say that. I want to just throw this out there for anyone who has not already done this. Curate your Instagram feed, especially your Twitter feed too, everything else too, but especially Instagram. Go through it really carefully with a fine-tooth comb. Find people that inspire you and that make you feel good and that give you things to think about that don't turn into negative obsessions, because that has been so helpful for me. And some of the, amazing psychotherapists I follow and, coaches and other people like you, seeing some of the things that are posted just really made me think. And one of the most common things is to talk about the feeling of being uncomfortable and sitting with the discomfort. And that's always bothered me. I have always been immediately bristled by that suggestion. And it finally took kind of seeing that a lot on Instagram to make me go, why? Why does that make you feel this way? Like, what is that about? Because this is a pretty extreme reaction. And I finally realized that it was because I didn't want to admit it. But yes, my childhood was traumatic, and there is trauma that I will probably always have to deal with from that.
And sitting with a discomfort probably feels like sitting with all of that trauma just kind of in your mind.
Yeah, I think part of it is that, there's this attitude, especially, when I was first going to therapy and when I was in the hospital, there's this attitude of you just have to do it. You just have to get through it. And the idea that there's anything that you don't ever fully get through, that you have to keep living with for the rest of your life, was very counter to what I was being taught. It was very much not what they were saying. It didn't fit with what I grew up hearing. It was move on, get over it, and just go about life.
Yeah, it's like you process through this and then you're done and you're
Yeah.
healed and you go back to your regular life, which, yeah, I can understand why certain programs and practitioners kind of want to paint it that way, because it's so much easier for people to swallow than the messy reality of trauma recovery. And I can see why it would make you bristle too, because you're just like, well, why can't I just be done with this? Like, let me get through this and move on.
Yeah, I did all this therapy and I spent all this money and I took all this time out of my life and like, you're telling me I'm not done? Like, what are you talking about? And it's kind of funny because my husband and I were just having this conversation last night about something completely unrelated, but it led me to this. And we were talking about how people, in terms of behavior, a lot of times don't evolve a lot after like puberty, after like middle school or high school. the behaviors of people, unfortunately, don't evolve a lot. And I sometimes feel like we do kids a disservice by telling them that it's going to get better. Because in some ways, of course, it is. You learn the coping skills that you need. But some of the actual behaviors that you experience from other people don't get better. And that is an unfortunate reality. But I think pretending it doesn't happen is doing a disservice to everyone who is going to have to figure it out on their own eventually. But I tend to be like really grounded in that sense. Like I am very much, I would always rather have the brutal truth. So I understand that's not how everyone works, and I try to respect that. I think because I grew up with so much secrecy and dysfunction and lies and manipulation and gaslighting, I would just always prefer to know what's going on, and to know that the world is a mess, and that your life, while yes it changes, in a lot of ways you still deal with all of the same kinds of things. You're just dealing with them in different ways. And that's not bad. The idea that we have to resolve everything, that everything is a problem to be fixed, puts so much pressure on us.
Yeah. I mean, especially right now, we're talking in the midst of the COVID-19 pandemic. Everything feels like it totally sucks. And there definitely are things that can be fixed about this, like money given towards the people who need it, who are unemployed, who've already been marginalized, who are hungry, who need assistance. Like there are tangible things we can do. And there's also just this big unknown and this sort of fear and discomfort that we have to sit with of like, this virus is out of our control. We don't have any cure for it right now. And it's just very contagious. And all we can do is socially distance as much as possible and try to not let it spread and try to flatten the curve. But it's like, that's really hard and that's really scary. And all of our lives are very disrupted.
Yeah. And it's going to be months. And that's just the reality. I am actually kind of a virology and epidemiology nerd, which is really, really weird, I know, but
useful right now, actually.
yeah, right. I wanted to be a doctor when I was a teenager for a while. And I honestly think, as sad as this is, that part of why I didn't is that I felt like I was fat, so I couldn't be a doctor. I mean, that was certainly not the only factor going into it. My life being chaos didn't help anything. But there was definitely a thought of that I would never be able to be a doctor because I was fat. But anyway, I've had this fascination with viruses and epidemics and outbreaks, and part of it may be that my great-great-grandfather died in the flu of 1918. So I grew up with that kind of like family like legend or history was told in like the legend story, the old time story. And then also when I was in like 5th grade, when we learned about bubonic plague, I don't know why, it's probably really weird and dark, but I was fascinated. When this all started in in January, when we first heard about it, it was like, this is going to be big. Like I just knew right away. So watching it kind of unfold has been a little surreal for me because there's a lot of things that I've been telling people that are close to me for months, and now they're kind of coming true. And I feel like, I don't know, like Cassandra, like a prophet of doom.
Oh, yeah.
Which was not my intent.
No, I feel you too. I mean, I have some friends who are like my germaphobe friends, my friends who, are often really heightened about any sort of sickness. And oftentimes I'm in a position of like trying to calm them down and be like, it's okay. This is not something that, this is sort of an irrational anxiety. And like, that's the role that I play with those folks in my life. But I feel like the script has been flipped with this, where I'm like, man, I really wish I had listened to them. I wish I had taken this more seriously to start. Not that like, thank God nothing has happened to me or my family or my loved ones, but I wish that we all had socially distanced and washed our hands more and avoided crowds like from the people that were talking about this, a month or two ago.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, and I worked in daycare for years, and I was a health and safety coordinator, which is basically like the manager. I was in charge of keeping up to date vaccinations, and I was one of the only people who could give medications to the kids. And I trained all the new staff on the, protocol for sanitation and everything. So I actually dealt with an outbreak in my infant room when I was working in the infant room. We had a foot and mouth disease outbreak. It's very, very contagious. It's one of the few things that you cannot kill with 65% alcohol sanitizer, just so everyone knows. So, like, I kind of was through this. And so I knew these protocols because I had been trained in them. Things like when you use a public restroom, you don't turn off the faucet with your bare hand because otherwise you're getting it germed up again, for lack of a better way to put it. You're germing it up. And so, I'm the one that's like taking the paper towel, using it to turn off the faucet, using it to open the door. And like, I've always done that. Most people don't do that because they don't know to do that. And so I'm like watching people talk about, oh, I always wash my hands. And I'm like, yeah, but you don't know that that's not all of it.
Right. There's so much more. There's germing yourself up and then touching your face too. Like,
yeah. I mean, you leave a bathroom in, like, for example, like a gas station, like a convenience store at a gas station, and you go out to the, main part of the store. Anything you touch after that, anything you touch in between that and when you get in your car, which is where, hand sanitizer comes in. Anyway, sorry. I don't mean to give a health safety lecture.
right now where we are, I feel like we could all use a little more health and safety lecturing, and like once things calm down, we can go back to sort of hopefully doing the things that you're already talking about just in our day-to-day life and not being quite as freaked out. But I feel like right now it's like the most you can do it without hoarding, like sanitizer and wipes, please.
That's what leads to that hoarding, though. It's that feeling of being so helpless, of feeling so vulnerable and wanting to do anything to give yourself a sense of security. And that is what leads to that kind of hoarding. And, toilet paper of all things. I'm like, this is not norovirus, people, but,
Right.
at the same time, I get it because toilet paper is relatively inexpensive. It was relatively accessible until very recently. It's something that you can keep forever until you need it, and everybody's going to need it eventually. So I get the psychology behind it, even though I understand that from a practicality standpoint, people overdid it, and that has kind of screwed other people now. But I've been really careful with telling people online, basically saying to people, look, you don't know anybody's situation. You don't know what's driving this particular behavior. So when you give out these lists of how much toilet paper one person needs for 30 days or how much sanitizer, and you say that like the sanitizer could fill a bathtub, that's not helping these people. That's not giving them anything but shame over what they've already done. And that isn't really productive right now. It's not. I mean, it's enough to just say, look, you don't need to hoard toilet paper. It's okay. There's going to be more toilet paper. They will make more toilet paper, I promise.
And I think too, like all this hoarding behavior comes from feeling like we're caught off guard and feeling like we're not prepared. I think that is the case for a lot of people who are feeling these tendencies like, okay, I wasn't taking this seriously enough. I wasn't doing as much as I could have been doing. And now the world is ending. So let me like get all the things to make myself as protected from this as possible, which is completely understandable. We're all really caught off guard. We're all feeling so fragile and so anxious about all of this.
Yeah. And, the thing is, I was in Manhattan for 9/11. And so I lived in the post 9/11 New York City reality. And it was really scary. I mean, it was so surreal and so scary. And in some ways, there's a lot of similar feeling to that now. There's a lot of similar uncertainty, except that in the case of that, it was terrorism. And in the case of this, it's a virus. But we didn't know, would there be another attack? Would there be another issue? And people were preparing. They were stocking up on water. They were scared and they were reacting to that fear. And while it wasn't necessarily quite as extreme as this has been, it was definitely a real thing, especially in the city. And I was very glad we had that water and that we had bought a couple of bags of Snickers in case of emergency. So, yes. So, I kind of learned all of that. I learned all of this sort of preparedness stuff, and that helps, but it's still triggering.
Well, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the food scarcity piece of this. And like, you mentioned having a bag of Snickers with you. It's like that is such a helpful thing, and being at a place of peace with food where you're able to have that as your emergency food or any sort of...
Oh, I wasn't at the time. No, at that time, I was still very much caught up in diet culture. But I will say, to my credit, that I think by then the wheels were sort of coming off, the shine was sort of fading, and I had kind of figured out on some level that dieting wasn't really going to ever get me what I thought it was. I wasn't ready to admit that for a long time, but I had started to see it on some level even before I met my husband. So, like late 1998, I think I first started to realize it. And it took another, well, it was like 2007 when I stopped dieting for good. So, it took a long time to finally get there. It was a process, but I think that I was calm enough in that moment. Like, I wasn't going to obsess about calories, or, well, it would have been points most likely at that point, but I wasn't going to like let that stop me from having food at that point in my life, basically. So at least there was that. I mean, I may have felt guilty about it afterwards, but it wasn't like, you can't eat that. Oh my God. And there was a time where that would have been the case. So there was an evolution of sorts. But it was also not entirely easy. And honestly, it's still not. I still struggle, especially since I had my surgery, because that kind of triggered all of those old feelings. And so now with the, pandemic and the social distancing, which is kind of funny because I was already pretty socially distant, but it feels different when it's not your choice, even though my life on paper didn't change all that much. I'm home every day. My husband works from home every day. So on paper, our lives are pretty similar to what they were before. He's still working, fortunately. I write and do my own things, and I don't have any kind of schedule. So there's that. I don't have to answer to anyone, which is nice. And my life in that sense is the same. But it's important to remember that choice is a big deal. And that's kind of the same when it comes to dieting, because that sort of takes away your choice. It takes away your freedom. And that feeling of losing that freedom is really scary, and it feels crushing at times. It feels overwhelming. And when you do it because you're trying to make your body something it's not, and then you could look at what we're going through now, it almost feels, I don't want to use the word silly because I don't want to be dismissive of anyone who's actively in it, because I know what that's like. But at the same time, I feel like this is such an awesome opportunity to realize that there's so much more to life than dieting.
It really is. I'm curious, for your own experience, how did you get to a place of being ready to stop dieting, and then also going into the surgery piece? Like, how did you decide to do that, and what has been the outcome?
It took two things for me to stop dieting. One was leaving New York City. I don't think I could have done it, at least not as early as I did, living there, because there's so much pressure on looking a certain way. And I had to listen to women who were very petite and very much small and not at all, fat, talk about being fat because they weren't a certain size. They weren't this size versus the size they were. And so they were fat. And it was like, no, 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 just shut up. Like, I mean, I want to have sympathy, but at the same time, it is hard when you're in my body and you're listening to your pound friend saying that she's fat. Like, no, you're not fat. You're not fat. Like, there's just no world in which you should be perceived as fat, which isn't to say that you won't be, because unfortunately you might, even at a low weight. Some people get perceived as fat, and I was one of them at one point. When I was on my first diet, I lost weight like most people do, and especially because I was a kid and I was active, and it was summer when I was put on my diet. So I lost weight, and I was actually technically, by the BMI standards, underweight at one point for like 5 minutes. But I was, and that was when they weighed us in gym class. And I had no idea I was underweight. Nobody ever treated me like I was underweight. They never treated me like I was anything but fat. So I understand that even people who are not fat get treated like they're fat. But at the same time, there is no way in hell that someone who is a straight size, a thin size, whatever you want to call it, looks at my body compared to theirs and does not realize that I am the fat one. Like, that just doesn't happen. You two are swapping clothes, and I am lucky if I can find clothes. And that was my teenage experience. So living in Manhattan was a lot like that experience. moving to Colorado, and it's so ironic to me because Colorado is always listed as like the thinnest state when they do those stupid surveys.
Oh, God, yeah.
I hate them. But it's funny because I moved to the thinnest state and I have experienced way less fat shaming here than I ever did living back east, which, I mean, believe me, I'm very glad about that. And that's not to say I haven't had issues, because I have, particularly with a couple of doctors. But so I moved here and I was getting ready to start another diet and I just felt broken. I don't know a better way to put it, but the idea of starting another diet made me feel broken inside. It was just soul crushing. It felt like this unbearable. It was like Sisyphus, it was like trying to push a rock up a hill and falling back down over and over and over again. And it's like, how many freaking times am I going to try to push this damn rock up the hill? Like, clearly it's not meant to be on that hill. It's clearly meant to be down here. And so I decided I wanted to talk to a nutritionist. And my doctor's office happened to they actually had a dietitian on staff. So I went and I talked to her. And unfortunately, she put me on a diet. She didn't call it a diet, of course.
Oh, just a healthy eating plan or a lifestyle change or...
It was using the dietetic exchange system, for diabetes patients, which I was not one. It was just another diet. I mean, I got home and I looked at it and I tried to do it for a few days. And I was just like, dude, this is the same thing as what I've done 8,000 times before. It just felt like I couldn't do this again. I just couldn't. I had thought about signing up for Weight Watchers Online. I had been a diet blogger in New York City back in the fairly early days of blogging. I had a blog that was called The Pretty Face because, of course, every fat woman is familiar with the expression, "Oh, but you have such a pretty face." And I called myself The Pretty Face. And I was doing this for a long time. I had a pretty decent following. I mean, it wasn't like I was a big deal or anything, but, I had regular readers. I had people that I talked to. I had people that I exchanged gifts with at Christmas. And when I found out about intuitive eating, it was after the incident with the dietitian. I found a therapist in my little tiny mountain town that specialized in eating disorder treatment. And her entire practice was based around the idea of be yourself. And that was like eye-opening. And I went in fully expecting a diet, fully expecting her to give me some diet book or some diet plan and tell me, here you go, this is what you have to do. Like, that's actually what I thought was going to happen. So when I walked in and she made it clear from the very beginning that that's not what was going to happen, it was just like, I didn't have to be doing this all these years. It was like, I mean, it was just revelatory. It was amazing. I felt free for the first time in my entire life in a way that I never had before. And I was so ready. I was so ready to soak it all in. I immediately ditched my diet blog. I started a blog called Eating My Cake. And so I did that for a long time after I first discovered it. I did it for probably about 2 years. And then I kind of felt like I'd reached a point where I didn't really need the blog anymore. And I didn't feel like I had anything particularly good to contribute to the blog anymore at that point. Like I had kind of reached where I thought was my peak, I guess. And then a couple of years after that, I was diagnosed as pre-diabetic, which is a diagnosis that I despise, that is really bullshit, and mostly to sell diet drugs.
Yes.
Right? Diet drugs and diabetes drugs, because the pharmaceutical industry saw an opportunity. We can get these patients on diet medications to make them lose weight. We can get them on diabetes medications because that'll help them prevent getting diabetes. And it's bullshit.
Yep. And we can make more money and create more customers by creating this new bogus diagnosis that a very, very tiny percentage, like single-digit percentage of people who are diagnosed quote unquote pre-diabetic will ever go on to have diabetes. So how did they justify calling it pre-diabetes when it never actually turns into diabetes for most people? Unclear.
I mean, not to mention that a lot of the diabetes meds are not necessarily safe for people who don't need them. So it's kind of scary that they're giving all of these meds to people and maybe you don't need them. And I had already been through that because when I was still in New York, right after getting married, I was diagnosed with polycystic ovarian syndrome. And I had insulin resistance, as almost everyone with PCOS does. And they put me on metformin, which was horrible. I had such terrible stomach problems from it that I honestly don't feel my stomach ever was the same after I stopped taking it. I mean, I already had stomach issues. So, in all fairness, maybe if somebody already has like IBS, like I did, that's going to make it worse. But I feel like it made it worse. And I remember I was in class in New York City. It was a math class that I hated. And I was sitting in my class trying to pay attention. And all of a sudden, I felt like I was going to shit my pants, to be completely blunt. And that is a very known complication with metformin. It's a very known side effect. So I ran to the bathroom and it was horrifying. I mean, like, it was just, I was so mortified and I was just so relieved that I made it to the bathroom. At that point, they tried to change my dosage and I was still taking it until I moved to Colorado. And then I finally was like, my doctor here was like, if you're not diabetic, you don't need this. And I was like, really? Because I hate it. And even when they diagnosed me as pre-diabetic, that same doctor did not try to put me on medication. But she did start talking about eating restrictions. And that was really, really triggering. And I didn't see it at the time. I didn't realize it was happening. I so overreacted. And that's not a shocking thing for someone with an eating disorder history. But I went out and I took out every single freaking book I could find at the library about pre-diabetic diets. And I wasn't even thinking of it as a weight loss diet. I was just thinking of it as, I have to eat this way because I don't want to die, because that's what everybody's telling me is going to happen. And my dad was diabetic. So I saw what diabetes did to him and I was scared. And it didn't occur to me at the time, like, but there's diabetes on both sides of my family. I was probably going to become diabetic no matter what. And eventually I did. But I actually think that I may have made things worse because I wound up trying to restrict so much. And I think that cycle is so damaging to the body. You know, that restriction binging cycle, that losing a little bit of weight, gaining weight. It's so damaging. And I don't know about any weight gain I had at that time because I had stopped gaining weight. But I did know that my food was all over the place. And I was kind of trying to pretend it wasn't. I didn't really want to admit it, I think.
Did you still think of yourself as eating intuitively at that point?
I did. And I thought of myself as doing it wrong, which, of course, is not the case with intuitive eating. That's not how it works. And I knew that. But, you know, that mentality creeps back in. And that sort of event is the same kind of thing that triggers it. So that kind of set off a series of events. And then in 2010, I was having horrible stomach pains intermittently. I had been having them for roughly 9 months. They started in October of 2008, and I would just wake up in pain, absolute agony. I would be like crying. I would have to go sleep in the guest bedroom because I couldn't be quiet and I didn't want to wake my husband. And I didn't know what was causing them, but I had this gut feeling that it was my gallbladder. Just deep in my gut, I believed it was my gallbladder. So I would go to the doctor. Well, okay, what happened? I was asleep. When had you last eaten? I don't know, maybe 10 hours earlier. No, that's not your gallbladder. That's not how it works. Okay. I didn't want surgery, so I was willing to pretend I believed them, which is really what it was. I was just trying to deny it because I didn't want it to be true. But I really believed it was. And I went along with the doctors. And then after 9 months, I wound up with a gallstone stuck in a bile duct, in my bile duct. And I was in so much pain. It was the worst pain of my life. It was absolute hell. And I wound up in the emergency room in early August of 2010. And I was so sick. I was throwing up. And my husband is such a saint. Like, he was standing in front of me in the emergency room so that nobody could see me throwing up, which was like one of the sweetest things he's ever done. Who wants to be watched? I mean, although honestly, I was too sick to even care, really. But like, you know, it was just, I appreciated the effort. And so it was really scary. It was really bad. I was really, really sick. And he was afraid I was going to die. And if I hadn't gotten treated when I did, I may have. But even then, they had to stabilize me before they could remove my gallbladder. So I was in the hospital for several days. And I was admitted on Sunday. I was discharged Thursday afternoon. I had my surgery on Wednesday. It turned into this series of events that all started with the gallbladder surgery. And then I had the hernia. And then after the hernia, I had the cellulitis. And then I had the lymphedema that never went away, that I still have. And I broke my foot twice
Oh my God.
in different ways. All of this combined with the prediabetes diagnosis that came in the same time period, combined with I think even the surgery, the gallbladder surgery, and my response to that, eating so low fat for so long afterwards. I think all of that sort of set me up for being in a really bad headspace in ways that I couldn't appreciate in the moment, because it's a cumulative effect and it's the kind of thing you don't see until you're looking back at all of it. And that's a frustrating reality in life. That just happens with all kinds of things that cause mental health issues. You look back on it, and it's when you look back that you can see all of it so clearly. And it's like, why couldn't I see this in the moment? And the answer is, it's not possible in the moment. You have to wait until it's all there. And then you see it. And it's frustrating, but that's just the process. Unfortunately, I didn't realize that until after I had the weight loss surgery. And that was prompted by another fall, as you know, because I wrote about that in my HuffPost piece.
For anyone who hasn't read that, can you just share what prompted the weight loss surgery? Like, what was sort of the tipping point? Because at that point, too, as you wrote about in that piece, like, you were really fully on board with fat liberation. You had been doing your best to eat intuitively and make peace with food on your own, and like supported the cause of fat acceptance. So you were sort of the last person who would have thought that you would get weight loss surgery.
I was very much the last person that anyone would have expected to get it. I had lost friends online because I referred to it as medically approved anorexia, and I stand by that. Even after having had it, I stand by that 100%, maybe even more now than I did then, because now I'm on the other side and I can see what it did to me, and I know what it's done to some of my friends. And obviously, other people have different experiences, but it is also very important to understand, and this is not at all a dig at anyone in this, but if you're in it and you're experiencing all of the positive things that you wanted, the weight loss, the smaller clothing sizes, the sense that you have more freedom than you did before, whether that's real freedom or perceived freedom, it doesn't matter. Even if it isn't something that was restrictive before. But for some people who are very fat like I am, it is also legitimately true that losing weight will make your life easier. And that shouldn't be true, but it is. And so that's a really big thing for me, is that I find that sometimes fat acceptance forgets that these people on the far end of the spectrum, the really fat people like me, and again, that's a neutral description. That's just me. I'm really fat. It's okay. I'm cool with it most of the time. We have a lot of obstacles in the world that make it so much harder for us. For those of us at the extreme end of things, it's not that cut and dry. And for me, what it was is that I fell on vacation and winding up in emergency rooms, although this time I didn't go to the emergency room. But I fell because of fat phobia, ironically. I was in a little cafe in Minnesota with my husband, and it was very tight in there. It was a very small building. It had a lot of tables. It was very full. And we got there right before the lunch rush. The people started crowding in the vestibule. I think there must have been like apartments upstairs, because there was like a second floor. And they were like crowding around the stairs. And I just thought to myself, looking at those people, how am I ever going to get out? And I was panicking. It was the anxiety building in my chest. I couldn't even like enjoy my meal at that point. I just wanted to get out. And my husband could see it. He knows me well enough at this point, and he could see it building. And he was trying to get me out of there. So he went first, because he is a big guy, like 6 foot, and he's built big, and he's to the point. He doesn't look like someone you want to mess with. So he went first, and that made it so much easier. But then he let me go ahead of him, and I forgot that there was a very, very steep step up from the side. I mean, it was probably close to a foot. It was really steep. And I just went down on my knee, and I, in my panic, held onto the door with my right arm, because, you're falling and you're thinking, oh my God, I'm falling. I don't want to fall. And in that moment, you forget that you're better off just falling most of the time. So I held on and I tore my bicep, probably because I couldn't get an MRI. And I knew I wouldn't be able to get an MRI. I knew that I wouldn't be able to get really much of anything done. I knew it was soft tissue damage. It felt like soft tissue damage. And I knew that they were just going to be like, ice it, put heat on it, see a doctor when you get home. I got back and I went to my doctor and he said, it's probably a torn bicep, but, without imaging, we can't really know for sure. So we're going to treat it like that. And it was, take NSAIDs and ice it and put heat on it, alternate, and all the things that I was expecting.
And just to sort of clarify too, for anyone who's listening, like the reason you couldn't get an MRI was because of your size, right? Because they don't make MRIs big enough, or they don't think that fat people can get MRIs.
Well, in my case, it wasn't even a weight limit thing. Like there were MRIs where I would have been in the weight limit, but my body shape prevented me from getting them. And I knew that because a couple of years before, I had to go get an MRI of my brain because I was having symptoms that were concerning and they wanted to rule out anything wrong in my brain. And I wound up having to go to an open bore MRI, which is a specialized type of MRI that's much bigger, much more open. And for people my size, it's more reasonable, but it still has a weight limit. And it's still, at this point in time, I was probably like right at that weight limit, but I felt like I couldn't fit in it. Like I just thought that I had barely fit in it just for my head and that putting most of my body in it wasn't going to work. So I knew that from experience and I weighed more at this point. Like I didn't know how much more, but I could feel it. I knew like my clothes and everything, you can tell. And so I knew that I had weighed more than I had, prior when I had that other one. So that's why. And that's what I mean when I say that when, fat acceptance, people are talking about internalized weight stigma and internalized fat phobia. And I saw something recently, I don't remember who it was that put it up, and I'm not name calling anyway, because I understand where it's coming from and I agree with this sentiment overall. But the gist of it was that if you think about being a smaller size and you're thinking about it from a perspective of it's going to make your life easier or it's going to, anything like that, that is internalized fat phobia. And in a lot of ways, I agree with that. But when you're talking about someone where it's a difference between I don't want to have to go up a size and a difference between there's no size to go up to, it's not the same thing. And you can't blanket statement because that isolates those of us in that extreme category, in the far end of the scale. So for me, it's just, when I hear people say things, it's very hard because it's like, please remember that for those of us who are super fat or fatter, if you want to use InfiniFat, if you don't, that's cool, whatever, you use your terms, but whatever you want to use, when you are at that end of the spectrum, it isn't the same. It's just not. It's not. And it's not fair to expect us to feel the same way. And this was really, really hard for me when I decided to have the surgery. I was severely injured. I was suffering. I was in so much pain. I have permanent damage to this day. I can't use a can opener without that muscle spasming painfully. It's not like a little spasm. It's like terrible. And the slightest movement can set it off. So I was living with that. And at the same time, my grandmother was going through multiple cancers. She had been diagnosed with 2 types of breast cancer and a type of lung cancer, all within like about 18 months of each other. And she was going through PET scans and chemo and a lot of things that wouldn't be accessible to me easily if I were ever to get sick like she did. And there's a lot of cancer in my family. So like I started thinking about this, like it was really hard not to. And I had done all the research. I knew the risks. I knew, or I thought I knew all the risks anyway. I knew all the risks. I knew that it's a false promise in large part. And I knew that the number my doctor gave me was bullshit. Complete bullshit. He walked in, he spent 5 minutes with me, if that, and he threw a number out, which I won't say.
Which would be like your goal weight or whatever.
Yeah. What he said was, we can get you to X pounds.
But when you ultimately had the surgery, what were the complications that you had? Because I know you've written about the fact that they're actually worse than you expected them to be.
Yeah, and I didn't get into detail in that because in the Huffington Post piece, I have written about it on Medium, but the biggest issue that I didn't have any surgical complications like I did with my other surgeries, which was something that I was really scared about. I was okay. I mean, I was miserable, but I was okay until about 3 weeks post-op when they did my first set of blood checks and they tested my thyroid. And I have Hashimoto's, which is an autoimmune disease.
Yep, I got it too.
Yeah. And it means that your body attacks your thyroid hormone. So you never have enough. And when I first found that out, I was like mad for my thyroid because everybody had always blamed my thyroid, basically saying that it was like lazy, that it was not producing enough thyroid hormone. And I was mad because I felt like my thyroid was being shamed the same way I got shamed. And so when I found out that my poor little thyroid was actually working its poor little ass off, I was so mad. I was like, it's making hormone. It just doesn't work. So anyway, I told them. They knew that. And I don't think they believed me. Honestly, I really don't think they believed me. I don't think they believed that I had ever tested positive. And they didn't check. They didn't check my thyroid and they didn't check my antibodies or anything. I mean, they checked my thyroid levels, but they didn't check for the antibodies to verify that yes, okay, it is Hashimoto's. And they just kept telling me, "Oh, wait and see. Your thyroid medication dosage, which is staggeringly high, is gonna go way down after the surgery." Not so much. I was almost at thyroid crash levels. My TSH was at 26, and for people who don't know, normal is like generally considered to be like around 1 to like 3, ideally. And it was 26, and I was miserable. And I was losing weight at that time still because I was barely eating anything. I mean, just literally barely eating because you can't. So I wasn't like, I was worried about it, but I was like mostly just surprised. And they were like, wow, your thyroid was really high. We have to up your dosage. And I'm like, hey, didn't you guys tell me I was going to get my dosage lowered? Like, wasn't that the promise here? And they're like, oh, yeah, but you're off of so many other medications. Isn't it so exciting to be off all of your meds? And I'm like, I'm on all kinds of new meds. It doesn't matter.
Mhm.
She's like, but those are supplements and vitamins. And I'm like, yeah, it doesn't really feel different. Thanks. So the thyroid thing was a big problem, and it's still a problem to this day. I have been hyper. And I had never been hyper before. Hyperthyroid, anyway. Hyper, yes. Hyperthyroid, no. I had never experienced hyperthyroidism, and hyperthyroidism is even worse than hypo in terms of how you feel mentally and physically. I was having crazy heart palpitations. I was having really high heart rates, and I have anxiety disorders. So that triggers that. One thing triggers another. So my heart starts pounding, and I feel it pounding, and it's like, oh my God, it's being so hard. And this was despite the fact that I had lost a bunch of weight, And so it's like my mental health is shit. I am the most depressed I have been since I was in college the first time when I was 18. I was feeling so overwhelmed with everything that I really disconnected from most of my friends. And I really haven't changed. Like, I've just been so much more isolated. I just don't have the energy to talk to people the way that I used to. And I feel bad. I feel really guilty because my friends, are sad and like they get it. I have really good friends who are understanding and, they've been very patient. And I feel like sometimes they're waiting for it to go back to the way it was. And I don't feel like I'm ever going back. And that is sad. And after my surgery was when I found out that there is a much, much higher rate of mental health issues in post-op patients than is normal in the regular population, even amongst bigger people, even amongst people who are fat. And that was when I found out about the self-harm rates and the suicide rates that are much higher, the risks that are much higher. And even my psychiatrist didn't know about that. And I had done my research. Like, I am a thorough researcher, if that's not obvious. But I never came across any of that information ever in my research. So they do a lot to try to keep that buried, and they don't tell you about it. And they know your mental health history. They knew I had eating disorder history. They knew I had anxiety disorders. They knew I had a history of clinical depression. And not once, Was I ever warned about any of it? Yeah, they talk about the superficial parts of it. Like, if you're not losing as much weight as you expect, you may get discouraged. That kind of bullshit. Like not the really heavy shit where it's like you may lose weight and still feel like crap. And then because I made the mistake of letting myself get weighed after my surgery. I had originally said I wasn't going to. And at the time, it felt like the right choice. And if I went back and did it again, I'd make the same choice because in the moment, not knowing felt worse than knowing. But unfortunately, it's another one of those things where it's a cumulative effect. And there came a point pretty quickly where it was obviously a problem for me to be getting weight again. And I stopped, but I couldn't at that point. It just felt like I couldn't. And that was really like pretty much right after the surgery. And because I wasn't interested in numbers prior to the surgery, I never did any research on like what the average weight loss was. Like that wasn't what it was about for me. I never expected to be thin. I never expected to be even close to thin. And I just wanted an MRI and to be able to get a winter coat because I couldn't find a winter coat in my size. But I didn't expect, first of all, the incredible cognitive dissonance that it caused. Doing something so antithetical to everything I believed in was really hard. I was going through the process of getting approved for the surgery for a good 6 months. I had made the decision almost a year before I had it, and I told almost no one. So I kept it to myself and just a couple of close friends, and that was it. And very few people knew, other than my husband and my doctors. I had to sign up for Weight Watchers for 6 months, which I did not do. And thankfully, my doctor, who is a different doctor now than I had before, he is very empathetic. And I explained to him, I have to pretend I'm dieting for 6 months, but we both know what will happen if I diet. So can I just come in and get weighed and you can report that I came in and got weighed and told you that I'm still a Weight Watchers member? And he was like, yeah, that's fine. So that's what he did. And I had the surgery, and after the surgery, my first weigh-in was 1 week later, and I freaked out. And it wasn't even about I want to be thin. It was about I did this and that's the result.
Like the amount of weight you lost was too low.
Yeah, like I felt like I should have been a bigger number because I didn't know what to expect since I didn't do that particular research for the very purpose of I didn't want to set myself up to fall into that trap. And it didn't matter. Even without that, I still did. And it happened right away. If I was that upset, and I wasn't in this expecting some extreme makeover of my body, how hard is it when someone who is gets a promise like the one my doctor made me about a number at the end, or gets a number on the scale that is really not what you would expect? And, it turns out that's all normal because there's so much swelling and there's so much water retention in the beginning that it's actually really normal. And some people gain weight, which, by the way, they don't warn you can happen, but it's common, was what I learned when I read about it. So I actually was kind of lucky, but that sort of fed into it too, because then it was like, whoa, maybe I can get to this number. I mean, it wasn't even like, I just had this moment of like, no, we're not going to think about that. That's not the point. And it never was. And I didn't let it become the point, but it still messed with my brain. And I was okay then for a while. The first 4 months I lost weight steadily. And it was what the doctors expected. Not that I ever saw the surgeon again, but that's another story. The office, the people that I saw at the office, that was what they expected. It was all fine. And then it kind of slowed down. And that was when my thyroid was going crazy again, because I was briefly almost stable, but still not quite normal. And then it went hyper for the first time. And I was surprised because I was like, didn't they always tell me that people who have hyperthyroid are thinner? Like, isn't that the promise? And instead, I'm suddenly not losing weight now. What's up with that? But I was also learning to adjust to this completely alien way of eating and without an appetite. When you are literally never hungry, it's easy to forget to eat. It's easy to just get caught up in your day and not eat. And then what would happen is I would get migraines and I would be dizzy and I would be shaking. And eventually my hunger came back. And it was like my body was saying to me, what the hell have you been doing to me? And that was hard too, because then it was like I was always hungry. I was starving, but I couldn't even eat that much. So it was like physically, you can't hold that much. But I still felt hungry. And it wasn't the same as psychological hunger, because right after the surgery, I had lots of psychological hunger. Now, sometimes I vacillate. I'll go from no appetite to holy crap, I'm starving. And it's so easy for that to happen. And that didn't happen to me before. Before, I was at a point where I knew how to moderate my food intake in such a way that it was like my body was getting what it needed when it needed it. And it didn't need to tell me like it does now, where it's like panicked. And that's what it feels. It feels like my body is panicked.
What about the digestive issues? Because you had digestive issues previously. Did any of that flare up more after the surgery?
Yeah. I had always been more on the diarrhea side of IBS. IBS people tend to have constipation or diarrhea. Some people go back and forth. I tended to be more on the going too much type of IBS. I was experiencing really bad constipation. I have had a bowel impaction, and that was not that long ago either. So I still have issues after 2 years. And it's funny because my best friend had the same surgery. My childhood best friend of almost 40 years had the same surgery, and she has the same kind of gastrointestinal issues as I do. And like, she has the same kind of problems that I have, where it's like, she's had obstructions, and I haven't had that yet, and I'm hoping I won't. But like those are really scary. I mean, impactions are bad, but like bowel obstructions can kill you. So it's scary. And there's a lot of foods I can't eat. I can't drink plain water because plain water sits in my stomach like a rock. And that is apparently very common. They tell you to get sugar-free Jello, but apparently a lot of patients can't tolerate it, which one of the nurses told me when I went for my follow-up, and I'm like, that would have been nice to know. Instead, you told us to stock up on it, and I can't freaking eat the stuff because it just sat in my stomach like I felt like I was going to get sick every time I eat it. So I developed a really rare condition called burning mouth syndrome. It started in September of 2018. So it was like 6 months after my surgery. It's based on, I have a really dry mouth, which I mean, I have medications that do that. I live in a dry climate. I've always had a dry mouth anyway, because I have a deviated septum and I am a mouth breather. And I hate when people make fun of mouth breathers. So I have like things that contribute to the dry mouth, but the dry mouth is so much more severe. But water was my beverage of choice. And I can't tell you, like, I watch the water run sometimes when I'm doing dishes or something. And it's like, my mouth waters because I just want to take a big drink of cold water. And the burning mouth syndrome made this issue worse because when the burning mouth started, water began to taste like soap. And that is apparently a very big issue with this condition, that it makes foods taste weird. So on top of all of the food restrictions I already had because of my surgery, things that I never intentionally restricted anything. So now, in addition to those food restrictions, I have all of these things that don't taste normal anymore. Things that I loved to eat and I can't eat them anymore because they don't taste right, or things that I would drink like plain water. And the thing with the stomach, like the water with your stomach, eventually most people are able to start drinking water again. It takes time. Not everyone, but most people. But I can't even try it because water tastes like soap. And who wants to drink soapy water?
Ugh, sounds awful.
It's hard, and it's so much harder because of all these little complications that add up and become a real problem. And it doesn't matter that I know all of the things that I know about intuitive eating or health at every size or fat acceptance. Like, I didn't care about being thin. If I could have had a fairy godmother come and tell me she could make me thin, I wouldn't have chosen to be thin. I would have just chosen to be able to get an MRI and find clothes in my size. Like, seriously, that's all I wanted. And I shouldn't have to resort to cutting out 80% of my stomach to try to get that. Nobody should ever feel that way. They should never feel cornered. And that's how I felt. I felt trapped, and I felt like I couldn't win, and I had to try it because I didn't know what else to do. And that was oddly similar to how I felt when I stopped dieting. So it was really weird, and it just caused all this, like, I didn't want to tell anybody. I was afraid that all the people I knew in the fat acceptance movement were going to disown me, basically. I was afraid to say anything for the longest time about it. And then finally, after my surgery, I told people. And I actually had to unfriend people because there were people who were like congratulating me for taking a step to better health. And I'm like, fuck you. You know, that's not what this is about. I tried to be patient, but there were people that I cut off because I didn't want to hear it.
What would you say to someone who is considering weight loss surgery? Like, what would you tell yourself 2 years ago from the perspective you have now?
I would say that it's not worth it, and that even if you achieve the weight loss that you're hoping for, it's going to come at a cost. And that cost is something you can't plan for. You can't research your way out of it. You can't intellectualize your way out of it. You can't know what it's going to be. And that cost could be your life. Like, that's the reality. It could be your life. It may not happen often, but it happens. And it probably happens more often than we know because surgical complications are only for 30 days. So if it goes outside of that range, even if it's a direct result of your surgery, however many years ago you had it, it doesn't count.
Yeah, it doesn't get reported as a surgical complication.
Someone who had a surgery 5 years ago who gets a bowel obstruction and has sepsis and dies, they're never going to blame that on the surgery, but it's because of the surgery that happened. It's because of the scar tissue. And yet the person is more likely to get blamed. Even if someone mentions the surgery, oh, well, they probably weren't following the rules. The rules don't apply when it comes to scar tissue. You get it or you don't, and there's really nothing you can do to control it. And it's scary. And I know that, like, what I did could still impact my health moving forward because it continues to impact my health. And it made my mental health way worse. It triggered all of my old eating disorder habits. It triggered a lot of my old internalized fatphobic bullshit that I hadn't thought of for years. And now I'm like retraining my brain out of it. And I never thought that would happen. And I don't even like to admit it because it feels like going backwards in such an extreme way that I just never thought could happen. But it's important that I mention it because I feel like anyone who thinks that they can manage this and still be like pro-fat acceptance and not re-internalize a lot of that shame and a lot of those feelings, you're wrong. You're just wrong. You're going to. It's just inevitable. It's going to happen. No matter how prepared you are, it is going to happen because you can't get much more prepared than I was. You can't have been much more realistic than I was. And it happened. And the worst part is that for most people that it's happening to, they aren't able to see it because they're so steeped in it. And so they defend the surgery. They talk about it being the best decision they ever made. But then in the next breath, they say something that I might say about the surgery, except that I see clearly that is a complication. Like someone will tell me, oh, I haven't had complications. And in the next breath, talk about, some of the stomach issues they've had. Guys, that's a complication. That is a complication. Maybe it doesn't feel like one because you're still losing weight and you're happy about that. And people are complimenting you and you're happy about that. But the weight loss isn't going to last forever because even if you get to your goal weight, which is highly unlikely, unless your goal weight is realistic, and most of them aren't. And by realistic, I mean within the average percentage for these surgeries, not like some BMI number realistic. I mean, when you look at the data and you think about what the average weight loss is. And I was never going to be an average patient because I had been over pounds since I was 15 years old. Like I told my surgeon after he made me a promise that there was no way I could ever get there. It's like, oh, we'll get you to this. And no, you won't. I have been this weight since this time and I am now this age. It isn't happening. And then he amended it by pounds the day of my surgery without saying a word. He went up pounds and didn't mention what I had said, but clearly realized that I was obviously right. Because otherwise, why would he have done that?
Right.
And, he kept pushing me to set a goal. And I didn't really want to. I mean, and I didn't I just picked a number kind of randomly based on my previous set point weight. But what I wasn't realizing is that set point weight was when I was 10 years younger and didn't have a bunch of health issues. So that was not even realistic. And I didn't expect to get there necessarily, but I would be lying if I said that there was a part of me that kind of wanted to. And the irony of that is I wanted to because that was a point in my life at which I could have done most of the things I wanted to do. And I didn't let myself because I was too fat. I was healthy. It was before I had fibromyalgia. It was before I had all my other health issues. I was active. I lived in the city. I could walk all over the place. I took the subway everywhere. I was constantly moving around during the day. I mean, I was going to school. I was, going to see friends. I was all over the place. And I hurt my knee. And I didn't appreciate any of it. I took it for granted. And I was waiting, and I say that and I spell it, with the word wait, as in lose, because that's how it feels now. I was waiting to live my life because I wanted to be a certain weight before I did things. And just don't do it. I mean, frankly, if the current coronavirus thing teaches us anything, let it be that. Let it be that life is unpredictable and it's short and you don't know what's going to happen. So don't wait. Just live your life. It's not going to go anywhere otherwise. You have to at some point just say, even if you can't let go of dieting, even if you're not ready to let go of that, because I get that, the seduction of being a certain weight, even I just fell victim to that. And it wasn't even a thin weight by any means, but it was just a weight at which I had been before for a long time and felt comfortable at because I was used to it. And it's kind of like when people talk about their high school weights, and I have never been able to relate to that because it's I was fat in high school, so I don't know what you're talking about. But in a way, it's the same thing because for me, that was kind of roughly my high school weight. That was my early 20s weight. And I realized all the things that happened to me mean that I gained weight and I'm not going back there. That's just not happening. And part of that includes years and years of yo-yo dieting.
Yeah. And so just don't wait. Don't wait for all that stuff. Just live your life now.
You want to go to the beach, you want to go on a Caribbean cruise and wear a bikini, get a freaking bikini if you can. And there are some clothing places, there's a company called Smart Glamour that custom makes things. They make things up to I think a 15X. Their website is amazing. I haven't ordered from them, so I don't know personally the quality, but I've been told it's great. I want to order from them. I was supposed to be going on a cruise in September and I was going to order from them that, but now I'm not.
Yeah, all these things that are getting upended, which is all the more reason that when it's done, we don't need to wait.
Exactly. Now everybody's waiting.
Yeah.
Everybody in the world is waiting to live their life again right now. And eventually what's going to happen is we're going to have to learn how to live our lives in a new way. Because I don't think this is going anywhere anytime soon, unfortunately. So there's going to be an adjustment period and there's going to be a point at which, we flatten the curve. But until that point, everybody's waiting. And if that doesn't teach you that life is too short, I don't know what will.
That is such a good point to end on. And this has been so wonderful. Thank you so much for sharing your story and everything you did. And can you tell us where people can find you and learn more about your work online?
Sure. I am on Twitter, Instagram, and Medium as I am Juliet James. I am on Facebook. I have a Facebook page, but I'm most active on Twitter and also on Instagram. Those are the places that I'm more active. I also have a website, iamjulietjames.com. There's not a lot there at the moment, but it does exist. And I am editing my novel that I'm hoping to self-publish later this year. It's called Craving, a mostly fictional memoir. I wrote it for National Novel Writing Month in 2018. So I wrote it in a month.
Wow.
So it needs a lot of editing. But so I'm kind of working on that and I'm hoping to get that done before the end of this year. That's my goal now. And that will be on Amazon whenever I'm done with it. And of course, my website will have that. And then I can be emailed at jj@iamjulietjames.com.
Amazing. We'll put links to all that in the show notes so people can find you and connect with you. And thank you so much for being here. This was a wonderful conversation, and I appreciate you taking the time, especially when the world is just chaos outside.
I've been looking forward to it. I was so excited when you invited me, and one of my friends was like, I told her privately, and she was thrilled because she's read your book twice already. And I haven't even read your book twice already, and I feel really bad. But I'm a slow reader when it comes to nonfiction. I'm a fast reader when it comes to fiction.
Well, don't feel bad. Whatever pace you read it at is great. And thank you for that.
I am 50% of the way through, and I swear to you, I have highlighted more of it than I haven't. I almost feel like I shouldn't share it on Goodreads because I feel like it'll show too many of my highlights, and that's not fair. That's how many highlights I have.
Aw, that's awesome. Thank you.
It's an awesome book, and I have already learned so much. So I highly recommend it to anyone who hasn't gotten it. It's so informative, and it's so different from anything I've read before, which is really cool because it's hard to have like a unique perspective or a unique voice on topics that a lot of people are talking about. So I think that's really cool.
That's amazing. Thank you so much. Really appreciate that. So that is our show. Thanks again so much to Juliet James for joining us on this episode, and thanks to you for listening. If you've gotten something out of this podcast, please help us reach more people who need to hear the anti-diet message, because who doesn't, by sharing this episode and subscribing to the pod on Apple Podcasts or your favorite podcast platform. You can see all the places to subscribe at christyharrison.com/subscribe. That's christyharrison.com/subscribe. You can also leave us a nice rating and review in your podcast provider of choice, which is another way to help new listeners discover us and is always very much appreciated. If you're looking for some practical tips to help you get started on the anti-diet path for yourself, grab my free audio guide, 7 Simple Strategies for Finding Peace and Freedom with Food. Just go to christyharrison.com/strategies to get it. That's christyharrison.com/strategies. To get full show notes from this episode, including all the resources we discussed, plus a full transcript, go to christyharrison.com/235. That's christyharrison.com/235. And to get the transcript, just scroll down to the bottom of the page and enter your email address. This episode was brought to you by my online course, Intuitive Eating Fundamentals. If you're ready to make peace with food, break free from diet culture, and reclaim the life it stole from you, learn more and sign up at christyharrison.com/course. That's christyharrison.com/course. A big thanks, as always, to our editor and sound engineer, Mike Lalonde, our community and content associate, Vinci Chue, and our administrative assistant, Julianne Watasik, for helping me out with all the moving parts that go into producing this show every week. Our album art was photographed by Abby Moore Photography and designed by Melissa Alam. Our theme song was written and performed by Carolyn Pennypacker Riggs, and I'm your host and producer, Christy Harrison. Thanks again for listening, and until next time, stay psyched.